something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear.
The Vietnam War began as a Cold War containment strategy, but quickly escalated into a several-year-long conflict, resulting in many American and Vietnamese lives lost, lots of spent American money, and a divided country. It all began with the installment of Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader, after Vietnam had finally declared itself independent after centuries of imperialistic rule. Vietnam became divided between its communist north, led by General Ho, and the pro-American south, led by Diem, an American-installed puppet leader. The conflict between the north and south went on for years to come. Forces in the north, known as the Viet Cong, used guerrilla warfare tactics to weaken the enemy in the south. They used a sophisticated system of tunnels and trails through which they transferred supplies and soldiers. The fighting proved extremely bloody, as the United States executed several bombing raids on the North Vietnamese, among them Operation Rolling Thunder. While usually relying on guerrilla warfare tactics, the VC surged past the 17th parallel into South Vietnam on the night of a Vietnamese holiday known as the Tet Offensive. While taken by surprise, the United States, with support of South Vietnam, put down the counterinsurgency. While it was a military victory, many see this as the turning point of the war, as support back home dropped drastically after the incident. Until the war's end, loss of support was a recurring theme. Through embarrassments like the My Lai massacre and questionable events like the Kent State shootings, the people of the United States began losing support for the war more and more rapidly until we finally withdrew from Vietnam and settled on an agreement in the Paris Peace Conference. We accomplished almost none of our goals and settled for an agreement almost identical to that which was laid out before the war. Nevertheless, it is a crucial part of our history and a very debated topic to this day. This is the view of a boy who grew up during the Vietnam War.
And we had a draft at the time. So all males were required to be participants in the draft for the military. And you were called based on the number you had. And I happened to have a very low number. My number was 340 at the time. And as fate would have it, I was called. When I grew up, we all assumed that it was our obligation to serve in the military. It wasn't something that you questioned. Today, of course, it's much different. There is no draft today, and as a result, anyone who's in the military today is there because they volunteered. At the time I grew up, it was not a voluntary situation. You were drafted. But our sense of patriotism might have been slightly more highlighted than it is today. We would accept these things without challenge. It wouldn't occur to us to challenge our own government. Of course, you recall that President Kennedy was then assassinated. President Johnson took over, and he continued to escalate the war. They really didn't know what else to do. America had never experienced defeat in a war. And there are many today that would argue we still have never experienced defeat. I would suggest that we're rationalizing what our greatest hopes would be. That in fact I would look at Vietnam as a defeat. That we were unable to achieve and accomplish the objectives that had driven us for so many years and for so many of the loss of lives, over 50,000 American lives killed. When we arrived in Vietnam, we arrived at what would have been a major U.S. air base in a location called Benoit. Interestingly enough, as the times have changed, at this particular site is now the site of a shoe manufacturing facility of which most of the production is Nike's. Regarding the issue of media coverage, when I was a younger person, we would go to the theater, and the theater often would have two movies. You'd get a double feature. And in between, what we normally think of as an intermission, they would show a newsreel. And that newsreel would show scenes from World War II, the Korean War. And that would be the mass audience's exposure to that type of thing, other than in the print media.
This is Pleiku, 250 miles north of Saigon, the air base that was ripped by Vietnamese communist guerrillas. 8 Americans died in the attack that brought swift retaliation by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. From carriers and land bases, 49 jets struck back at staging areas just across the border in North Vietnam. The Red Guerrillas were able to slip by Vietnamese guards in the middle of the night raid and lob mortar shells into the area.
And each day, as the reports of war activities would begin to travel across the media, because this really was the first war that the media was fully engaged. We had television. Everyone could see everything that was occurring as it occurred. And that started to spark a level of interest on the part of individuals where they began to question whether the government really understood or knew what was happening. It was actually frightening to see how people were rebelling against a government that we had all grown up to believe couldn't do any wrong, that we were the best and strongest and wisest country in the world. How could we do anything wrong? How could we ever lose a war?
Yeah.
But in fact, we were fighting a war that may have been from the very outset unwinnable. There were high-profile individuals, people that even I looked up to for their athletic prowess, for example. What comes to mind for me is Muhammad Ali, an individual whose boxing career I followed very intently in my youth, an individual I even had an opportunity to meet at one point in my life. And he was really the first highly visible in terms of worldwide recognition that chose to declare himself ineligible as a objector, conscientious objector to the war.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some poor, hungry people in the mud for big, powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger. They never lynched me. They never put no dogs on me. They never robbed me of my nationality, raped and killed my mother and father. What, I'm going to shoot them for what? How can I go shoot them? Them little poor little black people, little babies and children and women. How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail.
The Too Much period first began in 1968 with the Tet Offensive. That was a surprise. It surprised the U.S. forces. Over 100 villages were stormed and bombed and invaded by the North Vietnamese. It was more than anyone would have expected. And that Tet Offensive really, if there was a straw that broke the camel's back in American public opinion, I believe that was the turning point. However, the war went on for another 7 years until April of '75.
Right.
And I think that's characteristic, that wars can't wind down overnight. That many Americans, if not most Americans, subscribe to. This war had to end. The war had a very bitter ending. I can remember that day. It was maybe in about April of 1975 when the last of our people were helicoptered out of Vietnam. We were watching it on television, live coverage, as the Viet Cong Army surged down into South Vietnam and took over all of the facilities and bases and the like. I'll probably never forget that. It'll probably be a lasting memory in my life. Whether it's a loss to the Americans or not has been debated now for the last few decades. I would err on the side that yes, it was. That for the first time, perhaps in the history of our country, we were not able to do all things for all people. Mm-hmm. That in spite of our military strength, we were unable to push this conflict to a clear victory for South Vietnam and a democracy. Right. So in that regard, I would say that it was a loss for America. Mm-hmm. That our ability to be the protector of world peace is in question. However, there is no other country that could step up and fill the void if we were to withdraw.
If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start